During the mid-1800s, families living in Ireland were mostly poor, which meant they lived in mud homes on the properties of landowners. They would share spaces with livestock at times and lacked privacy. This also meant whatever money they could make was always being given away to the owners of the land. Life wasn't easy for the people of Ireland, and especially for our family. Already being poor meant surviving off whatever they could. This included their meals. They tended to have diets based off crops, which meant a diet reliant on potatoes. Part of the problem around the famine was that once their food supply was short due to crop failure, many families were dying. Survival meant migrating out of the country to build a life elsewhere. This is when they migrated to New York, where they lived in cramped apartments and did whatever work they could come by, which our group will cover later. Moving forward with what had taken place during this time, many deaths. Death was common and inevitable for families that couldn't aid other members of their family. It was such a common occurrence that even one of the sons of our family also died during this time. It was hard to make sure that everyone was getting the amount of nutrients they needed to survive, making the younger children even harder to nurture. With that being said, the son that had passed during this migration time was the youngest child of the family. Though these families were able to migrate, it didn't necessarily mean they were living happily and coming by things much easier. It meant they had to work harder and even face discriminations in new territory. These families were still dealing with the deaths.
Okay, I will be talking about the living conditions in Ireland. For the most part, the housing conditions in Ireland were pretty horrible. The poor families lived in rural areas in windowless mud cabins known as clachans. A few dozen or even several of them clustered together surrounded by unfenced fields for raising potatoes. These were not considered villages because they lacked the shops, markets, churches, and other public buildings and some amenities associated with the village life. The Irish marry quite young, girls at 16, boys at 17 or 18, and tended to have large families, although infant mortality was quite high. The common Irish people would marry knowing their significant other had no money, no possessions to offer, and were going to live in mud cabins. So, one of the major causes of Irish poverty was that more and more people were competing for land. Ireland was not industrialized. The few industries that had been established were failing. Most of the large and productive farms were owned by English Protestant gentry who collected rents and lived abroad. Many owners would only visit their property once or twice in their lifetime. Their property was managed by middlemen who split up the farms into smaller and smaller sections to increase the rents. So this meant that a lot of Irish people who were already poor would give up all their money just to pay the rent. Right here we see our family, the father, whose name is Sean, the mother Haley, the daughter Brielle, and the two sons Billy and Connor. With no employment available, the only way the father could support his family was to get a patch of land and grow potatoes. In Ireland, farmers quickly discovered potatoes thrived in their country's cool, moist soil with very little labor. An acre of fertilized potato field could yield up to 12 tons of potatoes, enough to feed a family of 6 for a year, with leftovers going to the family's animals. So our families began growing potatoes. Our family was sustained as long as the potato crop did not fail. Unfortunately, during this time, the Great Famine was going to hurt our family as well as the other Irish people. In Ireland, the three famous P's, which stands for poverty, population, and potato. So the leaves on the potato plant suddenly turned black and rotten, which also affected the potatoes that had been attacked by the same fungus that had destroyed the plant leaves above ground. So our family decided to move to America. The father had just saved enough money to get everyone a place on the ship, and he discussed this possibility with the mother Haley, and the mother agreed. So right here, what we're gonna see is the family boarding the ship, and as they're walking towards the entrance of the ship, the father screams America in hopes of providing a better life for his family. The shipwright to America are also known as the coffin ships because thousands of people traveling to America died. They were driven by panic and desperation, so they didn't have enough time to pack enough food. And unfortunately, Connor, the youngest son, died on this ship. After days in sea, the ship finally arrives in New York. The city of hopes and dreams for these Irish people who were escaping the Great Famine in Ireland, who suffered a lot because they were dying of starvation. So now I'm going to be talking about the work roles for the Irish community in America. Irish immigrants often entered the workforce at the bottom of the occupational ladder and took on dangerous jobs that were often avoided by other workers. So the men, they took jobs for building bridges, canals, and railroads. The women took domestic work like being maids or cooks or caretakers or being servants to help provide some income for the household as well. During this time in New York, there was unfair treatment towards Irish immigrants and African Americans. They also both faced discriminations because businesses took advantage of Irish immigrants and African Americans who were both willing to pay at unskilled jobs for low pay. And in this drawing, you're going to see where the Irish immigrants lived as a community. They lived in tenement buildings. As I mentioned earlier about the Great Famine years, nearly 1 million Irish people came to America, which most of them landed in New York. The Irish found it quite tough with no one to help them. Therefore, they settled in the lowest of society on the Lower East Side and waged a daily battle for survival. The Irish are the second largest group of people to immigrate to the United States. But the long history of Irish immigration is filled with sadness, anger, and even tragedy. Many Irish immigrants did not want to leave Ireland, not even for the United States. Over time, many Irish climbed occupational and social ladders through politically appointed positions such as policeman, fireman, and teacher. Second and third generations were better educated, wealthier, and more successful than were their parents and grandparents.
For the Irish in the 1800s, Sundays typically included going to Mass within one of the Irish-run Catholic churches. Prior to the migration of the Irish into America, the British had a hate towards the Irish because they were Catholic, unlike the British who were Protestant. Upon arrival and settling into America, those anti-Irish sentiments followed them. The main cause was their Catholicism. Now, the American Protestants hated the Catholic Irish because they believed if they could follow their leader, the Pope, all the way from across the Atlantic Ocean, in comparison to the Protestants whose church leaders lived within their own cities, they were a threat, and most importantly, they were anti-American. In some other states, political anti-Catholic groups known as the Know-Nothings prevented the Irish from organizing themselves. That included burning down these Catholic churches. In New York, however, an Irish Archbishop, John Hughes, warned the mayor of Manhattan that if anyone touched his church, he would personally see to it that the whole city be burned to the ground. His church was never touched. Amidst the discrimination and the poor environments, the Irish found a few ways to entertain themselves. Of course, what does everybody think of the Irish? Drinking, and that is true. Many Irish drank quite often. Most drank socially and to escape reality. This is where the drunken Irish imagery came from. It was even said that the children would drink. They didn't only drink, they also enjoyed singing of their troubled times and past as a way of venting indirectly. Another popular pastime was storytelling. Whether it was passing down stories or even making them up, the Irish loved to tell stories. Some of those stories even got turned into jokes.
During the 1800s, clothing for the female was linen, which reached the floor like a dress that they could wear alone or pair it with the apron if they wanted to. They could also wear it with the brat, which was like a long coat. And for the males, they also had linen which reached their knees, So they could wear it by itself, or they could wear it with the onar, which was like a vest. They could pair it with brews, which is like shorts, or they could put it all together, or just wear a bra as well. So with the law regulations, they tie with religion because the Irish were Catholic, but at the time they were discriminated against and a Protestant belief was favored, and their religion was tested. If they practiced their Catholic beliefs, they could be fined or be imprisoned. It was also a felony to teach Catholic religion, and it was a treason to convert a Protestant to Catholic faith. The Catholic priests who practiced their belief in their own ministry would be subjected to penalties like death. In order to make a living, the Irish would export produce like meat, butter, cheese, and cattle, but then they were prohibited to do so. They then got an idea to raise sheep so they can export the wool, but then that was also prohibited. Now getting beer and malt, which was germinated grain, was expensive, only for the Irish because the price was raised only for them. This discrimination was surreal. Now, for land, they had pasture, but they wanted to make arable, which will let them be capable to produce crops, but it was prohibited to do so. Now going back to law restrictions against the Catholics, they were not allowed to go to school, travel by sea, or send people off to get an education on Catholicism. They were also not allowed in office or the right to vote. Their voice were silenced. Now with intermarriage, it was not allowed because they didn't want Catholics to obtain property. So if there was an intermarriage, the Protestant who married the Catholic would be subjected to the laws implemented on the Catholics, and they wouldn't have the guardianship of the child, and the children would have to be brought up with their Protestant belief. So with the migration, they were now able to vote despite the discrimination in New York. They had some relief from the conditions in Ireland. And that is our Irish family.